It's so difficult to say to people, go back and look how the country faced challenges. It's impossible really to use the past to uh, give a rosy picture of the future. But track records are very important, particularly that not a lot have changed in the country, except people like yourselves. Young people are much more. Again, in international public opinion, many people look at issues to do with us in Saudi Arabia as a political or security. Then you get the local public departmental managers or ministers or departments who sometimes on issues, they look at it from an economic point of view. But actually, the most important really is from the social angle. So people look at some things they want to highlight in our country, let's say unemployment. And people look at it from political security here or in those that are interested, mostly our trading partners or the industrial democracies. And then locally, they would look at it from an economic point of view. But the most important thing is really, on such issues, is really from the social point of view. Again, I was here when the Saudi Women panel, issues like this, they look at it from a different way in what I think in Saudi Arabia we should be doing it. So people look at it from a political point of view, symbolic point of view, like driving and things like this. But again, there are a lot more important things should be done for all. I think from what I have seen, witnessed in the past, but I was very young in the 60s, I was a teenager, so but I heard a lot. My generation was the one really, depends how you make it, how big a shariha.
Segment.
We were the ones between really the past and what they were planning, the future. I really should not perhaps talk more myself and maybe just do it through the questions. But my point of view is actually very positive. And I was between 2000 and 2004 working in Sagia. A group of us established Sagia to encourage FDI and look after the climate market of investments. And so I saw my country's economic, socioeconomic policies or lack of them from, right in the middle of it. Again, I think about the past and I remember the things we went through. And then I'm feeling very positive. There are a lot of positive things. But one thing for sure is you cannot sit on your assets, excuse the pun, and think everything is, wonderful and great. And you cannot, for many countries, like the oil countries, some of them went to the international development supermarket and bought the most expensive model, which you have to fix on the ceiling, then laid back and hoping that it would come and carry us. Some went to the IKEA of the international development and took little things and fixed them and, and some thought education is enough. It's not enough. I passed a degree without understanding anything in the course. I think I must have learned something. It's the process, by the way, of education rather than the content. I actually did engineering because my father frightened me into it. And He was almost illiterate. He could read and write, but he took a trip in the early 50s to neighboring Arab countries, and he was so impressed. He saw people who spoke Arabic. They had trees, they had green things, they had water, cleanliness. In the desert, our history was changing our thobs. We had two, not in my generation, but I mean later, earlier. And you book a bath day where you wash yourself and your clothes. We had so little in the desert, it's impossible. Even my generation, and I'm talking growing up as a teenager, as a young child in the 50s and teenager in the 60s, it's really just impossible. And if I talk about it, we'll need a 3-day seminar on this topic alone. The Saudis have had great challenges. They had good luck, sometimes I think divine intervention. They meant well. They were put through education, everybody sent in a time warp machine and sent to the end of the 20th century almost. We arrived with baggage, some good, some bad. We strolled through things. And Saudi Arabia has been the target of particularly bad people, and good people. Everything you want to do in the Middle East, you go with good or bad and start with Saudi Arabia. It borders 10 Arab countries. It is a huge country. It faces West and Southwest Asia, Africa, all the way to South Africa. I mean, you just stretch your arms and you touch South Africa and India. Well, on the map, you stretch your arms. Country was really good with a lot of people. Its foreign relations is almost unique in the third world, that they had good relations with the most respectable, successful nations in the world. And that is even from before big oil, big money, big projects, and before even the Soviet threat seeped above from under the table to on top of the table. So they have a remarkable, record for people who came from extreme backwardness. So there's no fear about the future. And the world is full of great successes. And the economy is so easy, it's the easiest thing. The trick is how to develop right across, in here and in here. I really must stop. Otherwise, I'll just go on and on. I'm practicing speech making here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'll introduce our next two speakers before proceeding with the discussion. Mr. Akram Alami is a partner in Bain & Company's Middle East office. He's a core member of the firm's global oil and gas practice with experience in other industrial goods and services sector. Mr. Alami has developed deep expertise in topics such as industrial operational excellence, scenario-based corporate strategy development, performance improvement, commercial due diligence, organizational design and implementation. Prior to Bain, Mr. Alami spent 5 years within the oil and gas sector working on projects spanning the energy value chain from concession investments to downstream construction projects. Mr. Alami has an MBA from the London Business School and a bachelor's in engineering from the mechanical engineering from McGill University in Montreal. Professor Adir Malik is a global fellow in the economies of Muslim societies at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies and the university research lecturer in development economics at the University of Oxford. He is also a research fellow of St. Peter's College, Oxford, and the research associate of the Oxford Center for the Analysis of Resource-Rich Economies. I'll start off the discussion with a few questions from my end, and then hopefully towards the end we can open up the discussion for questions from the audience. To start, I have a question for the panel in general. The diversification of government revenue and the diversification of the economy are two very different problems. And too often in the Gulf, I think we conflate the two. Instituting VAT taxes, lifting fuel subsidies, These are all diversification of government revenue, or even reducing the bloated wage bill we have in Saudi Arabia. This is diversification of government revenue and not necessarily diversification of the economy. Could you speak to the difference between the two, and in light of Saudi's Vision 2030, what's the focus, and what the best way to go about economic diversification rather than, or not rather, in addition to diversification of government revenue? We can start with Mr. Al-Alami.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Is this working? All right, great. So I completely agree with 2 points of views that have been raised so far. One is diversification of the fiscal revenue stream is very different than diversification from hydrocarbon type revenues for all of the economies that we live in. I also agree with His Highness's statement that people tend to think about diversification from oil as in we're moving away from oil. I may be biased because, as you mentioned, I've been working in the oil and gas value chain my whole life, but oil is here to stay, and hydrocarbons are here to stay, at least in our lifetime. So reiterating what His Highness mentioned earlier about this point. And for me, it's a natural curve. What I think about and how I react to this whole diversification away from oil when people bring it up to me is that you can't really compare our states and our countries to places like Norway, which is also very strong in hydrocarbons, or to places like Singapore. We're on a different maturity curve. We went through the curve of creation of the wealth, establishing the institutions, establishing the regulations, establishing the access to capital. And now we're just simply going through the normal evolution of any economy, which is building up the ecosystems around the social fabric that we want to create in our societies. When people talk about diversification away from oil, there are sectors that are growing up that are growing at a paces of 10 to 13% CAGR, hospitality, real estate. There are some sectors that are doing well in that, they're like real estate. There are some that are not, and we're learning from this. Like, for example, we were discussing healthcare earlier, and the concept of healthcare cities and healthcare tourism hasn't yet done well. The other thing that I think about when I think about the question you posed, Muhammad, is there's different ways of doing it. I mean, the Emirate of Dubai has been doing it very differently than the way that the Saudi National Transformation Plan has been doing it, or is planning on doing it. There's kind of the big bang, we need to step up, and the whole country needs to step up type situation, which is what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is embarking on. And then there is the slow-paced 20-year diversification program that the Emirate of Dubai, for example, in the United Arab Emirates has been embarking on. Dubai realized very early on that they can't rely on oil and gas revenues. So they invested in logistics. They've recently put a lot of money behind, and with the support, obviously, of the country, behind things like real estate. Dubai right now at the moment is seen as one of the biggest logistics hubs in the world. So there's two ways of doing it. Maybe I'll stop there, and I'll allow Adil to say a few words on that.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Diversification really is an issue that goes to the heart of all developments of, all discussions about economic development, but also all discussions about political economy. Because when we think about diversification, we're actually thinking about an economy that is dynamic, that produces a larger number and a larger variety of products. And that requires an economy which does not just depend on oil. So essentially, when we talk about diversification, we are talking about a non-oil economy. How important is the non-oil economy? We're actually thinking about private sector development. In fact, if there's one area for concern across much of the region, is that it lacks, by and large, with few exceptions, a private sector that is independent, competitive, integrated within the region, and with outside markets. Now, development of this independent private sector is as much of a political problem as an economic problem. Because you mentioned revenues. You remember before the discovery of oil, both in Kuwait and Qatar, the ruling families were dependent on revenues from merchants, from the pearling industry. What changed the equilibrium with the discovery of oil was that rulers tied many of these merchant families in local contracts, made them clients, and so they lost their power as an independent force. So thinking about diversification, we've really got to think about diversification of revenues, but not just through revenues from VAT, but actually also revenues from private sector. And the history of political economy, the development of political and economic institutions in Europe will teach you one important lesson, which is that as rulers become more dependent on merchants and on different constituencies for taxation, they give concessions. They give them private property rights. They give them a whole range of space to create independently. So we are really thinking about a subject where both economics and politics are hugely intertwined.
Excellent. Ambassador, do you have any comments?
I think we have to approach any diversification, transformation from all fronts. One of the things I learned in Sagia, and I used to go around government departments like Don Quixote chasing windmills. I used to bring slogans, and people used to think, like I'm a mad prophet of strange ideas. One of them was simply, you have to do something every day for economic growth, materially or non-materially. I mean, materially, put money or put legislation or talk about things or set up something. When in 1999, the Supreme Economic Council was established, it gave, a lot of optimistic emotions in the private sector. When the agency SAGIA was established again, it was so important in the country. When I was made chairman of SAGIA, I was so important for about 4 weeks, until they discovered the power was with the ministries who were in charge of specific things. You have to do the same for general services. Now, is this diversification or not? To me, you just have to approach things and look at the climate and let people flow into activities. Services in every sense, they have to be every day. You have to introduce something that will help services, price, quality, spread, competitiveness, whatever. Because if you don't, you'll suffer loss of income, more expense for the household, like if you don't catch up with urbanization, and you have septic tanks. I have a story to tell, but again, I'm worried that, it will be reported the wrong way, like what happened to me in 1 or 2 conferences. But that's another thing. I'll leave it for the book when I leave the job. Social services, you should treat social services like general services. Because we have a very long list of social services where we need the government to come in, quantitatively or qualitatively, to push. It will not happen just like this. There's just too much resistance within a fairly conservative society against issues, although women have done very well moving into things. And so you should diversify everything to make it easier for people. One thing for sure, whatever you want to introduce, you should look at all sizes and all types of economic players. All sizes, medium size and medium, small and large, and regulate for this, The other one is people with money, people with assets, people with expertise, and people with ideas, entrepreneurs. And you really must diversify truly in every sense and push. It's not enough in some countries that have jumped into modernization over a short period to expect them to behave like those have been at the forefront of leading world development. And over the last 400 years, losing 400 million people in wars and other, while developing science, technology, and going through it. So there are certain things you cannot expect, particularly in Muslim societies, because they were the last to be decolonized. Saudi Arabia wasn't. Even the Ottomans would not colonize us because we had nothing. So, our political system, socio-political structure, and social fabric, with whatever shortcomings or positive things about them, developed from the culture. Same for the Gulf countries. They are what would be called traditional political systems, which are greatly misunderstood. And of course, the other thing is, like the national transformation and also the 2030 vision, is to get government people from controlling many steps within. There are still things that have to be monitored and controlled by the government, policies and regulations. You cannot avoid it. I was so surprised, so many here in the United States is so heavily regulated. I was surprised by the power of the Congress to get into details of activities. So it's everywhere. But you need it quicker in some of our countries because you need to push things. One thing for sure, the government people in those countries had the best graduates and the best educated people for a whole period. And I think certainly in the case of Saudi Arabia, the government personnel, top personnel, were ahead of the private sector. But soon, within the 90s, as the government had a lot of financial problems, I think the private sector personnel and their expertise and knowledge about what's happening in the world, particularly that lots of things happened in the early 90s with regard to deregulation and direct investments into utilities that are normally for governments. And
yeah. Mr. Malik, you have a comment?
Very quick addition to this debate. When we think about diversification, we often just think about the private sector, or we think about diversifying wealth. But it's often forgotten that one of the biggest assets for the region is human capital. So it's as much about the diversification of human capital and the asset that it represents, and not just the tangible private sector.
Thank you. Actually, that leads me to my next question directly, and it's a question for the ambassador, but feel free to add any of your comments, the other panelists. And the question is really about human development. Are there any plans to overhaul the educational system in the kingdom? The King Abdullah Scholarship has produced some great results, and many of the beneficiaries of that scholarship are sitting in the audience today. But how do you see the kingdom's challenges and opportunities when it comes to education in Saudi Arabia on more primary levels?
I think that the Saudis were very courageous way back in the late 50s when they started pushing people out to study, contrary to what people think. And then in the 60s, when more money came, they sent them to the most open society in the world. And the reason was very simple. The education system here was very welcoming, flexible, and informal, not like Europe. I suffered in the UK in the early 70s, where a class was 500, 400, where we had to queue in the subject I studied in the meteorology lab, outside in the rain. Meteorology, not meteorology. I studied what was called production engineering. similar to industrial. And they had no fear about it. But the scholarship program had started way back, got interrupted once or twice for different reasons. Unfortunately, now it has been reduced because of money. When I was in Sagia, wanting to treat social services as an urgent form of general services, like you do with power, water treatment, etc., I felt that education in Saudi Arabia should have been more supported in the private sector. Because in our country, in our society, like a few Arab and I'm sure third world countries, but I'm not sure which, we support each other a lot, families, and there's also a very strong advice for doing charity work in people's faith, but also desert people had their own system and their own traditions about being hospitable, giving asylum, supporting each other, feeding people, etc. So there was this, and this would have been a very good market in education and in health. I think we had almost 10 years from the mid-90s to the first decade where this was lost out, where we didn't get opening up. And I clashed with bureaucrats who wanted to control the management of this. And you can't expect somebody to put 100 million, 200 million riyals, or whatever it costs to set up a private university. And a lot of businessmen wanted to find some people who would actually do it properly, and they would put a lot of money. The ones who had money by then and their age group, they didn't want to manage anymore, but the regulations stopped many specialists to come and do it, to come and manage, and the Saudis never had this except in government schools and universities. A lot of the staff did not want to go to the private sector then because there is no security in the job. So that was a psychological problem also. So, as I said, when you introduce something, you have to look at it from all angles and diversify, there's no doubt in everything, and just liberalize. And I use it with a small L, please. You just let people monitor, but don't control. There is this, what do you call it, OC something? Obsessive compulsive control freak sort of tendencies not because they want to do it for this reason, but because they're worried about being blamed. So they keep things, I think. Today I met one of the students who's studying psychology in management. I submitted myself first, and then my colleagues at the embassy, and then everybody in bureaucrats in Saudi Arabia for treatment, because there is that tendency. But remember, many things in Saudi Arabia did not have anything else before. So as if we suddenly were created with oil income and the government doing everything. So the Saudis never knew many different things. Other countries were traders before, doing many things, and were in touch with the outside world. So you have to give the Saudis some leeway in accepting their excuses.
Thank you. Next question is for Mr. Malik. One of the biggest challenges faced by resource-based rentier economies is that when the economy isn't doing well, they tend to know exactly what the problem is and how to fix it, and they institute the right reforms. But as soon as the economic situation improves, and in Saudi Arabia's case, if oil rebounds to maybe $80 or $90 in the next year, this poses a risk to all of these plans that are necessary for the future. Could you tell us a little bit on that?
This is the classic problem of all the resource-rich countries. Whenever there is an oil price shock, a negative oil price shock, it's treated as temporary, whereas all positive oil price shocks are treated as permanent. And that is obviously very appealing to whoever is ruling. I think, in a sense, the question is very important because unless you have fire under the feet of rulers, you rarely see change in the world. That's always been the case. And so there has to be a continuous pressure. And that is why it's so important that many of the radical reforms introduced under Vision 2030 are actually more revolutionary in their content than anywhere in the Arab Spring countries. If you look at Tunisia, it's one of the best examples of political reform. But on the economic front, there's no new concession. When you look at Egypt, things are the same. If you look at Saudi Arabia, for a long period of time, there was a debate about introducing a tax on idle land. If you know Saudi Arabia, you would know quite a lot of the families own expensive land out in the peri-urban areas, and many of these families are connected families. So for Saudi Arabia to institute a tax on idle land was equivalent to elites taxing themselves. Now, the fact that Saudi Arabia talked about these reforms for a long period of time, but actually instituted after the oil price shock, means that there was a genuine need. That's what Daron Acemoglu, who's a political economist in this university, talks about. It's the threat of revolution that actually triggers or forces politicians or rulers to give concessions. And that's where it's so important to build constituencies for reform in the Middle East. I think what the Middle East lacks today is not economic reform. It lacks the discourse for economic reform. Because in much of, all across the Middle East, you have this still a huge division between the Nasserites, the people who believed in a lot of state intervention, and then you have people who believe in neoliberal economic order. But in terms of a new vision that would serve the region, that is focused on the real economic challenges, is largely absent. So you need new constituencies. And for those constituencies, you need an alternative politics in the Middle East. And that's a politics of new concessions, bargaining structures, talking to people who would lose from reform. Because make no mistake, whenever you have genuine economic reform, it is never politically neutral. It will always affect some constituencies more than others. And there it is important, therefore, to build those alliances, consensus amongst elites, and actually communicating these policies to the local stakeholders so that you create those coalitions for reform which will survive even in the period of high oil prices.
Thanks.
Ahmed, if I may,
Go ahead.
I mean, if you think about it, it is actually not a good time to embark on an overarching kingdom-wide transformation program at the moment, right? Because you'd rather do this when you actually have the liquidity, right? When I step back and think about it, I actually don't think it has anything to do with what the price of oil is. I think it's agnostic. I think we're talking about 450,000 new jobs. I think we're talking about the private sector taking up 30% of the GDP. I think we're talking about being able to regulate, set up the institutions for the next wave of growth of the kingdom, agnostic of what the price of oil is. I mean, we all know that there's a funding gap currently in the kingdom, but I don't think that matters when it comes to, I mean, the cyclicality of the oil and gas sector is a very well-known thing. I don't think it matters what the price of oil is with regards to what's currently happening in the kingdom. I think it's a much needed, if I go back to one of the statements that were made earlier, it's a much needed social fabric change that needs to happen. And the way you counter it, from my point of view, is you plan, you plan, you plan. There are hundreds of initiatives in place. There are 24 ministries that are being aligned. There is a structure and a governance towards it. And the ambition and the vision might be huge, but also the mentality is that we will not fail. And no one mentioned the price of oil. I mean, if you actually think about it right now, the non-oil and gas sector is contributing more to the Saudi economy. But that's because the price of oil is 70% drop from 2 years ago. Currently a bit higher than that. You want to split the two is the way that I think about it, at least.
No, but why now? Why not when the price of oil was $140 a barrel in June 2014? That would have been the best time, and you mentioned this. So what makes today?
I think it's a. I go back to the social need for it to happen, which was the right timing for it.
Different people,
Exactly.
Yeah.
different age, different experience. I think that's the
Yeah.
main reason. That's because it started very quickly. And all of the reasoning, I don't think, it's just one of those things where it's a Saudi thing. I mean, it's not as theoretical as the left here or on the right. I think it's just people deciding to do something about it
Yeah.
because it went on for too long. And then you found that you missed a chance when the oil prices were high, where it just wouldn't really make any difference. You must not think about oil prices. Government problems, their own. And you have seen now, because of the thinking and because of what they're trying to do, they were able to borrow very easily. Nobody expected the size and pricing of the bond sale or bond program. And actually, there were even many of the banks who were offering to do direct loans. But borrowing is a bad habit. I mean, ah. You didn't miss much.
I mean, and if I may just add one last statement before we go on, if you don't mind. I mean, I work in Saudi Arabia quite often. I help private sector clients in Saudi Arabia. That's what I do on a daily basis. The mentality, if you may, on the street is a very positive one. It is a very engaging one. It is a very new stage in wealth creation for the kingdom. That's the mentality that we currently have on the street in Saudi Arabia. And I use the word on the street figuratively speaking.
Sorry, I have to dispute this. No, well, when you say the street, you mean
I'm at
middle
the private
income.
sector more than...
It is
yeah.
the people you meet. Yeah, they see it. But the impression is that what you might call the traditional thinking, maybe not expose Saudi thinking to... No. But the impact on them is not as negative as people think on that, different from... you see what I'm trying to explain? Many times we Saudis in the past, we used to make the excuse, no, people are like this, people are like that. But people are changing, and the youth is one thing, the educated, the high awareness, and then what you might call people on the street. I think economic side should be making an impact, trickle down to the street level. I think, but this is, you cannot do anything in those countries to really make a difference unless you always think of the street first. Certainly the government has been like this for a long time, particularly with the subsidies. Subsidies were more done for people on the street. Or in Arabic, when you say on the street, mean مرمي في الشارع ولا but actually, or those that in some countries stand around the street a lot. Saudi Arabia is too hot for them to stand around the street. So, but in some countries, you see them. I don't know what they're all doing.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
No, I finished.
Okay. If I could just add a very minor point to this, I mean, your question about whether things would be back to the same old routine when oil prices are high again. I think there is also a reason for cautious optimism due to one important social science learning we have, which is scholars usually talk about social learning, and it's the social learning of elites, how they learn from past events. And in Saudi Arabia's context, it's very clear that the decade of 1980s, when oil prices were low and Saudi Arabia accumulated a lot of debt, provided its elites an important form of social learning that they need to save during periods of high oil prices, which is precisely what Saudi Arabia did in the decade of 2000. So the response, the saving response to the second oil boom was far more favorable than the earlier booms. So Saudi Arabia actually saved a whole lot. It got rid of all of its debt and cleared the debt, but also saved for the future. So you could expect that if tomorrow oil prices were to be high, you may not see business as usual again because there's huge social learning on the part of policymakers.
Thank you. So the next question is on the Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Plan, and specifically, they've been focused more or primarily on economic development. But many critics of the plan have noted that there's little or no mention of political or social change. Is it possible to undertake such an ambitious economic reform process without focusing on the political and the social? I mean, many people speak about the social contract in Saudi Arabia as well, and many analysts fail to see that it's an inherited one. The social contract was inked, if you like, before the discovery of oil. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that we have a huge youth bulge in the kingdom, and their worldviews, this youth segment, differ greatly from the generation before. So the question more specifically is, does there have to be a political and social aspect to this plan for it to succeed? And is there that direction coming from the government? And I'll start with the ambassador before going to the next speakers.
I mean, there were many things in your question that I want to attack.
Go ahead.
So many I forgot them. You use terms that we generally don't like, that they are, textbook terms, and they don't apply to us. I mean, it is expected that governments, leaders, whatever, that they cover all what you need. Of course, some people think you don't need it here or there, and you need it in the third, fourth, whatever we're talking about. That's always a political issue, even in the most open democratic systems here. I think in some countries, the economy could make an impact. It will also give the governments in place more influence. Power is all the same, but more influence in removing obstacles in people's minds or emotions against changes in the other sectors. This is why many of us in Muslim countries or third world countries, and particularly Arab countries, are so frustrated that the world has been at it from the beginning of the 90s, the deregulation, globalization, other things. And many countries in the Arab world, different types, different backgrounds, have been sitting there, twiddling with their navels, looking at their navels and blaming others and making excuses that are really not very viable. Some Arab countries had a yacht where they sailed away from land. And they sat there, and from the captain's table to the engine room, everybody was having caviar and Pepsi Cola or Coca-Cola, or you know what I mean. And then the whole world's changing, and they were enjoying themselves, sunning themselves, from the stevedores and mechanics to the captain and the top first class, and all of them were sitting in this fantastic ship that sailed away. And in the mainland, lots of things were happening. A generation later, maybe 10, maybe 15 years, 20 years, they discovered that, they're running out of things. And the whole world went through a cycle where they've learned so many things, they experimented with things, opened so many things, and they were sitting there just, doing nothing, making excuses, inventing things. It's like there's a cable that goes to all the rooms, and you in your room, unnecessarily, and because of, in some countries, political laziness, they insist on using their own equipment, different from the world, while they're still using electricity. I mean, if they were doing something without electrical power, fine. But they were insisting on buying all the expensive equipment, but not using the same voltage and ampere and They were trying to reinvent things. So they have to get transformers, adapters, and all unnecessary things, and taking a long time at it. So this is what happened. Now, you could never do anything without looking at all of these things. In some places, people want to see hope, but they want to see things happening at all fronts, not just the economy. In some countries, you need a very well studied, very well prepared, and strongly instituted social program, because in their development and their entry into the modern world, they did not do it properly, and it was not balanced. And there are tensions. People want to do it like Saint-Tropez, people want to do it like I don't know where, people like to be like, you cannot expect people to get the most benefit from what is going on in the most advanced countries without, of course, having to go through a risky exercise. But generally, most of them have done actually much better than people expected, and I don't know why the fear. But you really have to take a careful look at it, and you have to give hope. Now, some governments think that, oh, well, by doing these things, it's obvious. But one of the best things is to set a target, to do it as a generation and say, we're going to move towards that. Let's get trained. Let's get educated. Let's get used to it. You have to go at all fronts and do things with it. And there are people, as I said before, education, to pass an exam and get a certificate is not enough. The interesting thing is about going to the States and other very advanced educational environments is that it puts you through a process that is very useful for your development as a human being. Generally, Saudi and Gulf nationals and other Arab countries, I mean, many people go back on this. In some countries, if certain genders are having problems with work opportunities, diversification of work or whatever, some will stay on and this, but generally most of them leave. And by the way, compared to Iran in the 70s, where a lot of the youth were protesting about that situation, many of them actually, and this was one of the first things that triggered worry about the Shah's government and its popularity, was a lot of the Iranians would not go back. Although Iran had a lot of things that's similar to the West, and they had a lot of opportunity. So it's interesting, but there is no doubt you cannot be strong unless you look at all these issues.
Could I just ask you to comment a little bit more on the geopolitical aspect of this? How does Iran's role in the region affect prospects for stability, prospects for sustained economic development, whether it's the interference in Yemen or the Gulf or the Levant? This rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, does it have any bearing on the topic that we're discussing?
Why do you ask me the difficult questions? Just because I'm ambassador? I thought you wanted me to come here because of my background in economic activities. Look, as I said before, you know, Saudi Arabia has been a target before. Everybody used to think it's a very soft target. And everybody in the past, from the sublime to the ridiculous type, tried to hit Saudi Arabia. From the Soviets to all the others, the remnants of Qaeda, the others, and the Daesh franchisees and all. And as I always say, and I hope most of you did not hear it, my colleagues or friends who've heard it before should close their ears. And that is, everybody wanted to hit Saudi Arabia because of what it is and what it means and what it could lead to, because of the location the oil, the holy places, and all of these things. And I say that every Tom, Dick, and Zawahari, excuse me, I've used it so much. Maybe most of you have heard it before. So, what we don't understand is Iran. Why continue to be enemies to so many people since now what will be now nearly 40 years? The Yemen issue is one of these. Why would we try to attack the militias of the Houthis and Al Abdullah Saleh? It is because they have been trying to take over the Yemen. Al Abdullah Saleh thinks he will trick the Houthis and then fight them again. By the way, he fought them 5 years ago. And when we then got involved, because he asked to come in through our border and attack them from another side, and then they complained, they started attacking us. Now, I don't know exactly the facts, but Iran started developing the Houthis or certain factions from about the mid-80s. They also put a lot of effort in after 1990 when they saw the Ba'athist and Ali Abdullah Saleh. You never know with him if it's ideological or there's no ideology, of course. When he supported Saddam Hussein's invasion and he hosted actually Iraqi airplanes, and then sent us a message that we could hit them in his airports if we wanted, but we didn't want. This was 1990, before many of you were born, I think. Now, do people think the Saudis have nothing better to do? And then maybe they diversify their politics or foreign policy, and let's go pick a country and hit it. They have been attacking us. They were going to take over the Yemen. The Yemen was going to be run by Houthis. And please just look at the little facts. The Houthis, or what ended up as the Houthi group, separate from their other affiliation to a tribe, is 60,000 people. Imagine 60,000 people supported by Iranian money, Iranian training, all sorts of things over the years, would actually now, because of the negotiations, because everybody wants to stop the military activities, they're going to get a third of the power. Imagine where you are finding yourself in a situation, and we are with of course, we initiated the Gulf Initiative. And this is, so basically you are seeing in the Middle East, if you go and make problems and kill people or set up militias and give them weapons, and you get away with it. People at the end, because everybody is rushing to finish whatever term they have, they want to gather everybody, yalla, sign, it will look good on photo op, ma salama. We have to live with the issues in the Middle East. We have to live with our actions and our intentions and all of this. Why would you spend 40 years, instead of looking after your own country and get Iran to be strong and prosperous and improve the situation for millions of Iranians, by wasting your effort in other countries? Actually, it's not waste. But evil has always been easier than virtue. When you want to do an evil thing, or maybe they don't think of it as evil, you go from one point to another and you don't care about anything else. And are we going to be now in the Middle East turning societies upside down and threatening everybody through the use of militias? Why are militias getting excuses? They're everywhere. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and others. This is the land of the land of the militias who then get accepted, and the UN and others, because they reach a stage where they cause so much problem. And we have to protect ourselves. They've been attacking us. Yesterday, 5 missiles sent. Every time we have a truce or a ceasefire, they continuously do it. They hide behind civilians, and there's always been a problem. We have to look for military targets all the time. There were one or two mistakes. And it is a problem because you cannot but do anything in your power to protect human lives. And then the peace of mind of those lives and their economic well-being. And this is paramount in the Saudi policy, be it internal, external, whatever. And we have to remove threats. The fact that maybe in the media and things it hasn't come through, but this is basic. You think that we just decided to confront Iran because of what they call political competition in the Middle East? Do you think that awful article in the Atlantic a few months ago, as if we want to share power? We never wanted to share anything outside. We have so much to do at home. We have threats. We have responsibilities. We have our own development. And we don't want a bad word said, but what do? You sit there and let them attack you, then where do they go from there? If we didn't do what we did, the Yemen would have been now totally Houthi, Saleh, and Qaeda. And we've been pursuing both Qaeda and the Houthi military activities. And the Saudis, you see, again, look at track records. Who has been doing this before? Who's going out of his way? And you don't realize what's happened in Lebanon, Iraq, and we see things that are so, I met once a group where there were people saying Iran is a stakeholder. I said, excuse me, I keep using this, being my first year in Washington. I always say I'm the new Saudi ambassador, and I don't know this, and I'm new. And I remember I asked these politicians and said, excuse me, I'm new here and I don't speak English very well. But explain to me, when you say stakeholder, does this mean like in the medieval days, the stakes, where you put it in the fire and you torture people with? Is this mean because Iran has a stake here, a stake there, a stake, they become stakeholders? But the interesting thing is that the Saudis are trying to do whatever is needed and at the same time or not. And if you look at this, please go back to the early years between 60 and 65. And nothing's changed in the mentality, the thinking, the parameters, the essentials and basics of foreign policy. And we have to strengthen our army, we have to deal with issues. And if people want to make it their business just to get to Saudi Arabia, they'll have a hard time. Of course, you can always hurt other countries if you intend to do it, and if you have the money and this. But what are they going to do? I mean, why don't they just look after their poor country, their people who are so advanced? Does this answer your question?
Yep, definitely. I actually have two more questions, but I'll have to leave them for the audience.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I hope I'll try to choose somebody that looks like he'll ask my questions. So, please, the lady in the front. Keep it short, please, and no statements. The mic is over here. No statements. And please tell us your name and your affiliation before you ask the question.
First of all, thank you so much for a great discussion. My name is Rasha Al-Bawardi. I'm a physician, interventional cardiologist at Mass General Hospital. It's been known, obviously, in part of this discussion, how Saudi is facing a lot of economic challenges with the Yemen conflict and the oil prices. But more importantly, with the new U.S. administration, we cannot ignore the fact that Mr. Trump brought up the Saudi in multiple speeches and debates, and how the accusations that we're not really paying for military services. How do you see the new U.S. administration affecting the Saudi economy in the next 4 years, or maybe even 8 years? And do you see that hindering the 2030 vision?
Who would like to take it?
I assume you want me. Look, what people say in elections is one thing. What people say in speeches, even when they're in power at the beginning or at some stage or about the topic, is another. But when it comes on the ground, what it means. We don't work with, thinking about a certain type of administration, what we do. Our things, we need to do them ourselves. Everybody knows what we're doing. There's never been a time where our policies are very transparent and people want to plug in to the benefit of both nations. Anywhere is fine. But I wouldn't take the statements as being a policy decision. So let's see and wait and see how they do it. But nothing will affect this 2030 vision or national transformation or your own things. It's because they are Saudi things. Nobody can say, no, if you privatize sanitary services, I will declare war on you. No, I mean, they all want to participate because it's going to triple the economy within a reasonable amount of time. There's so much potential, it's unbelievable. But you have to really open up and encourage people to come. And there is the issue of financing, by the way, which is, you have to watch this. All of these countries think their banks are enough. It's not. If all the Gulf countries and other Arab countries open up, there has to be a huge amount of financing. If you want to double your army, triple your forces, that's another issue. That is then when you look at policies of those that have sophisticated arms, and like what we would like, so as not to repeat some of the technical mistakes or in attacking the militias and the Qaeda in the Yemen, we need to get very clever weapons. Now, will a government here or there or everywhere say, no, I will not give you this or give you that? That is, then you look at policies, you see? I mean, if countries want to do something where you need them for, but business and your own development and your political, social, and economic transformations, you can't.
Yep.
And actually, a lot of the talk they do is not really meaningful.
Yeah. We're running out of time now, so I'll take 3 questions, but you only get 1 question, no statements. I'll have to stop you if it's more than that. We'll start, gentleman in the front here, and then the lady right behind over there, and then in the back somewhere.
More questions?
Yeah.
Maybe you collect them.
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Ahmed Al-Tayyar from Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco. My question is, we were going through, first of all, we're very proud of what's going on in Saudi. To keep it short, the plan is there. The execution of the plan, can you shed some more light about that? Like how to execute the plans that are there? Thank you.
Thank you. Could you give the microphone to the lady? Yeah.
Hello, thank you for being here. My name is Lamise. I'm an environmental engineer. And I just wanted to ask a question about, since this is an oil panel, so in the past 2 years, you've seen that KCARE had a goal of shifting into renewable energy from 54 gigawatts, and that number decreased to 9 gigawatts. So this is Saudi Arabia's policy. So I was wondering if you can comment on that. Is it due to the decrease in oil prices? And if the economy is, where do you see the future of renewable energy in Saudi?
Okay. We'll take one more question somewhere in the back. That gentleman in the back over there. Keep it short, please.
Can you remember the questions?
I'm trying.
Hello, I'm Salim Bidajani. I'm an undergrad at MIT and interning at SpaceX right now. I wanted to ask about one of the earlier points that we discussed, basically about how we are depending on the private sector in Saudi Arabia to become independent and solve the problem. This is something that excites me as a young Saudi, but I feel like the main issue
One
here...
question. Sorry.
Okay.
There's no time.
To be direct, my question is, if the private sector is so interconnected with government funding and they're directly affected with all of with the gap in funding that's going on right now, how are we planning to overcome that and develop an independent private sector that can actually operate without governmental funding and being affected by economic crisis and so on?
Thanks. Can we start with Mr. Al-Alami?
Yeah, sure. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I got execution of the plan, I got the KCARE 9 gigawatt question, why and how, and I've got the private sector independence. So I'll try and tackle them very quickly, Mohammed, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
A plan is a plan, and a plan is as detailed as it can be, and this one is pretty detailed. There's certain metrics that hit 2020, there's certain metrics that hit 2030. By the way, I may have to just caveat myself, I had nothing to do with the plan. I've read it, and I hope you have. So there's a bunch of interconnections that need to happen, that take into place. So there's kind of, as with any plan and the execution of any plan, you need to write things down on paper, then you need to mobilize things for it to happen, right? And with typical human nature, there's a bit of denial, there's a bit of acceptance, there's a bit of, oh my God, what have we accepted, back to denial, and then there's a bit of actual execution that needs to happen. Will they hit the metrics of 2020? Maybe not. But so what? They're still there, the initiatives are still there, they need to get funded. Right now the deficit is sitting in something in the range of 377 billion Saudi riyals. The funding gap needs to come into the picture. So for me, when you ask the question about how does it get executed, it's really just saying, all right, how do we fund this? Step one. Two, how do we mobilize against this? There's a plan in place, let's get the 24 together to do that. And maybe I'll tackle the execution question, the private sector question next. For the private sector to succeed, you got to think about it from a couple of ways, right? You got to think about it from an innovation requirement and setting up the system for it to be innovative. And the regulations and the easiness of the red tape to take out private sector stimulation, if you may. Second question, which I think is a more important one and is currently being tackled by the likes of Sagia, by the likes of Sama, by the likes of other big financial institutions in Saudi Arabia, is the funding question. Most of the banks in Saudi Arabia have established SME arms, established different types of loan structures for SMEs. So the financing question comes next. The third thing for the private sector that I'd like to mention is that because of the way that the kingdom has been developing over the past 20, 40 years, there is a very close connectivity between the private sector and the public sector. But that's a good thing, actually. And if you think about it, that is what will make the private sector succeed. Because I'll give you a live example. One of my clients right now is looking to say, in order for me to make this investment work, I need the concession on the land to drop down from 16 Saudi riyals to 8. And then the discussion happens. If this wasn't in place, it's a strategic piece of land, that's why there's a concession. If this relationship wasn't in place, it wouldn't succeed. KCARE. So there was a rebalance with KCARE. There was a bit of an overambition at the beginning, and what happened with KCARE was there was a rebalance, whereas the renewable side of other renewable energies and non-renewable energies came back into the value chain of who's going to supply electricity to the kingdom. So in order for you to say, I want to increase my mining in Saudi, you have to let somewhere for the mining to go. What comes out of the mines needs to go somewhere. So there was a bit of a rebalance of the mix. It wasn't a reduction of the importance of role of KCARE in the supply of electricity to the grid. It was more a rebalance of the mix that led to I think it was 60 or something like that, to 9 that happened with KCARE. And KCARE is one of the 24 entities that is actually crucial to the development and the delivery of the NTP. I'll stop there.
Okay, I think execution is absolutely the key, because if you look at various diversification programs in the region, literally all the governments in the first 10 years of their independence, they had national plans that talked about diversification, including Iraq and Saudi and the rest. I think I would, for brevity, I would emphasize 3 key factors: feedback, failure, and linkages. I think a lot of big programs fail on small details, and here I'm reminded of Albert Hirschman, who talked about how the space shuttle failed because of one rubber ring, inexpensive rubber seal. So the attention to detail is extremely important, and for that you need inputs from the ground. You can have excellent programs, but you need feedback. So that's the first thing. The second thing is failure. I think all across the region, both private actors as well as governments have been extremely risk averse. They get frightened at the slightest prospect of failure. Too much emphasis on conformity. In fact, if you look at some of the most remarkable stories of economic turnaround, whether it's Turkey or it's India or it's the German Bundesbank after the 1930s hyperinflation, including the possible reform of the Democratic Party after Trump's victory, they're all examples about how failure teaches us. It shakes the existing equilibrium. So we need to create in the Middle East a space for failure. And there you can think about banking sector reform, because in the banking sector you have bankruptcy laws, no separate bankruptcy laws in most of the countries of the region. In Egypt, if you're a small entrepreneur and you declare bankruptcy, you are barred from taking a public position, you could be put in jail, you would never get money again. So failure is the second part. The third thing are linkages, how different things link up together. For big programs to succeed, you need an overarching picture, how various things will work together. So if you think about private sector development, you have to think about labor markets. If you think about labor markets, you've got to think about education systems. If you want to think about all of these, any major reform of the labor market would require thinking about the kafala system, which requires thinking about these hundreds of and thousands of rentiers who benefit from that. So you need to have a full picture. And of course, you need to think about subsidies, because fuel and food subsidies obviously make manufacturing capital intensive. So you've got to think about linkages, thinking about the picture as a whole. All of this requires, I think, the most fundamental component for economic reform, which is state capacity. We know from Saudi Arabia's example and many other countries in the region, the states are fragmented. Bureaucracies of the Arab world were built for two major reasons. They were built to distribute resources, to bring disparate groups into the government's fold, and to distribute public employment. We now need a bureaucracy that coordinates and commits, that acts as a coordination and commitment mechanism. A bureaucracy that could actually collect information, process, and then make decisions. And I think the success of the program crucially hinges on restoring state capacity, which remains fractured all across the region.
Thank you, Mr. Malik. Ambassador, do you have any closing remarks?
I forgot the question now.
So one was on K-Care and renewables.
Somebody asked a question about executions or something.
And execution, yes.
About the plan? Yeah, of course. It's happening.
Yeah.
I'm not very strong on K-Care. As for the first one,
Yeah, it was the private sector. Yeah.
I think there's Mr. Dajani, you were mixing issues of financing and payments to contractors. I have a feeling in that question. Yeah, that we're talking about is two different things. How can they do this and have this? But one thing for sure, this applies to Saudi Arabia and others, if you're going to have serious development, particularly for real economies, not service stations, where you just let anybody do whatever they like and it's service-oriented. If you really want proper development in the long run in your large-size economy, if the local businessman who got used to a certain way cannot do it, you really, truly have to open up for FDI, foreign direct investments, and you have to make it easier. Because around the world, there are people who are doing bigger things than you've ever done as a new privatized activity, who want to expand their own, and they go to look for countries like, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the population growth, the demand growth, and so many things, and the infrastructure and whatever, will allow certain things, if they're opened up, to be really huge. So you truly have to think about FDI and have the proper regulation for it. The problem in some of these countries, particularly oil countries, all their lives, they made their money during the first boom and the distribution of income, and basically the government acquiring properties when they build roads, huge roads, and then becoming later middlemen between foreign companies and government projects. And some of these oil countries had to build huge things very quickly. Some continued, where the whole population of businessmen, because they had nothing before, are middlemen. So you might develop a nation of, like they used to say about England, the nation of shopkeepers. You'll end up, some of the smaller nations become a nation of middlemen. And again, that, if you can fund protection, security for them and other things, fine. But to have real nation building, you have to do it properly, and the economy cannot wait. As I said before, you get a generation born every day. And you cannot hold things for the convenience of government managers to fit your own, plans for the government. You have to really respond, and the only way is to open for the whole world, and properly organize it and regulate for it, etc.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you to all the esteemed panelists. It was a great show.
I thought this was lunch.